Filling in a space. So the first thing you're going to want to know how to do is to fill in a space. So I've gone ahead and I've drawn a leaf on my paper. You want to pick the right size brush. If you pick a brush that's too big, you're going to have a hard time, and if you have a brush that's too small, it's going to take you a long time to fill in the details. So I picked a medium-sized brush, mixed up my paint, and I'm going to start by cutting an edge. So what this means is I'm going to basically use the water in my brush I'm going to make a fence out of the water and the paint in my brush to kind of make an edge around my shape. I'm going to start at the top and kind of work my way down, because if I have one area that dries and then I try and go and work over it, you're going to notice that you're going to have problems that way too. So I'm going to slowly fill in the shape, making sure that the edge that I'm working on has a nice little puddle of water to work from. Filling in that shape, spreading the water, making sure that my edges don't get dry. Taping your work. So now that my leaf is dried, I notice a few little funny pools around there. I like how that looks, so I'm going to leave it like that, but if that's not something that you're looking for in your painting, you have a couple of options. So you can use a watercolor block, and that's got the pages all glued together so that the moisture stays even in the paper and it kind of evenly distributes, so it's not going to warp on you quite as easily. But that's expensive, so another option, which is cheaper, is to just take your watercolor paper and you are going to tape it down. Transparency. So one of the things that's kind of unique about watercolor is that it is transparent, which presents a problem when making mistakes, or if you make something that you don't like. With acrylic, you have the option of painting over it, and with oil paints, you have the option of just kind of scraping it off. But with watercolor, you don't really have that option. The paint is transparent, it's suspended in water, so if you try and paint over your mistakes, you're going to have a hard time. But this also works to your advantage. Most watercolor artists will use that transparency to build up layers of color in their work. So you can see where I've painted over that purple smudge. You can still see the purple underneath and the color layer on top. Wet on wet. So you can also work with your colors while the paint is still wet. You can blend two colors together by putting them side by side with enough water, and the colors will merge. You can also add dots of color and notice how the water will spread the color out, creating a tie-dye effect. Using salt. So you're going to want to do this effect while the paint is still wet. So get the colors that you want in the section, and then you're going to take just regular salt. You can use regular table salt, or you can use sea salt, which has larger crystals. And you're going to sprinkle it lightly, not too generously, sprinkle it lightly over the surface. When it dries, you'll start to see little tiny blooms of salt. In this example, you can see where I've used sea salt, and so the blooms are much bigger. Using straws. For this effect, I'm going to want to get a few little puddles of watercolor, try and make sure it's pretty concentrated in color on my page. Then I'm going to take a regular straw, like you would get at a restaurant, and I'm going to right at the paint. Blotting. For this effect, you can use paper towels, you can use cotton balls, you can use fabric. I'm going to use a paper towel, and then while your paint is still wet, you can gently dab areas where you want to remove pigment. This works especially great if you're trying to make clouds or a kind of a dabbled pattern on leaves. Masking and resisting. This you can use a wax-based pencil or oil pastel or crayon to draw any areas that you want to stay white on your paper. You can also use a masking fluid, which is a little bit trickier to use, but it's going to give you a much cleaner, whiter area. So you can kind of paint it on just like you would a normal paint. Make sure that you don't use a paintbrush because it is kind of a rubber-based medium and it will ruin any brushes that you use. So use something that's not going to get ruined. You're going to want to make sure that the masking fluid is completely dry before you paint over it. So test it out with your finger first and then paint over as normal. Rubbing alcohol. So again, while your paint is still relatively wet or damp, you're going to take some isopropyl alcohol. This stuff is kind of fumy, so be careful with it. Take a Q-tip and then pour a little bit in the cap so you don't have to reach in the jar. Take a Q-tip, soak it in the alcohol, and then you're going to dab your Q-tip wherever you like. Scoring. So for this one, again, you're going to want to use a wet area on your paper. You're going to take a sharp tool like a needle or anything else that's sharp and scratch the paper. Waiting for paint to dry. While you're waiting for paint to dry, please take care of all of your cleanup. This makes for a happy classroom. When you're done cleaning up, you can take out your sketchbook and practice drawing. Removing the tape. This is kind of the fun part, removing the tape and seeing all those clean lines. So to review, we have wet on dry, wet on wet, salt, straws, blotting, resist, alcohol, and scoring. Applying the techniques. So here I have a painting that I've started of a triggerfish, and I'm just going to use some of the techniques that I've showed you to start this painting and get the background painted in. I'm not going to tell you which techniques I'm using, so let's see if you can figure out which ones I've used.